I just went down an extremely deep and eye-opening rabbit hole. I might have to make 2 videos. This video is 3 minutes long. I apologize in advance for the length. So the rabbit hole started with this stupid TikTok that was like, you don't have to pay any of your debts. And they cited HJR 192 of the 73rd Congress, which actually was repealed at a certain point. Which got me wondering, why would the government be like, okay, yeah, you don't owe us anything for the next however long, and everything that you owe us right now, we're going to completely forgive it. Like, what made that start? So apparently the United States has been bankrupt 3 times. The first time before they were technically even a nation, the second time in the 1800s, and the third time in 1933. President Roosevelt said, screw gold money, we're not going to use that anymore. Also, everyone's gold money, I want you to turn it in. So that was when he issued the 3rd bankruptcy. And so when that happened, essentially the government was obligated to give the people something of equal value to the gold that they took. And so now our money isn't actually worth anything tangible. So even though they took back HJR 192, they still never actually gave us anything tangible in return for that. So actually, as far as I understand it, and I could be wrong, please let me know in the comments, but as far as I understand it, the American dollar is actually just a debt note. So every American dollar that you have in cash is just a note of debt that you have $1 of the United States as debt. Which begs the question, if America has no tangible money, then how do we spend it? The answer to that question is T-bonds, treasury bonds. Essentially, it's an IOU from the government, the federal government. You give the government like a huge sum of money, right? And then they say, okay, well, we will give you this money back with interest. As long as there is a United States government, this is a really safe place to put your money. So guess who buys all of these? Banks. Banks. Banks buy so many of these, okay? They buy them habitually. And when I learned that, all of the pieces came together for me. So we put money in the banks for free, and then the banks take our money and invest it in the government. The government pays them back with our taxes. And then we borrow money from the bank that we gave our money to for free, that gave the government money that the government uses our taxes to pay back. And then we pay the banks extra money for giving us our money back that they invested in the government. So I've heard this in bits and pieces before, but I didn't get every single piece of the puzzle right. Like, first of all, our government is still bankrupt. Like, the United States is bankrupt. Who knew that? I didn't know that. They don't teach that in history. Okay, guys, part 2. It is 3:23 in the morning and 62 tabs and countless number of hours of research. I am very tired, but we're going to go for this. So today we're going to talk about JP Morgan, and I'm going to make this definitely a very long series because there's way more to this than just JP Morgan. He's just a piece of this. But first, I've got to give the prerequisite to the stock exchange, the New York Stock Exchange, which was established in 1817. 1882, the Dow Jones Company was established. In 1889, they first published the Wall Street Journal. So by the 1890s, JP Morgan had done a lot of financial awesomeness and basically kicked butt in the whole railroad situation. He'd organized a bunch of treaties between different railroad organizations, and he had pretty much made a buttload of money off of different investments. So between the 1870s and the 1920s, there were a lot of these things called bank panics, where people would freak out and they would take all their money out of the banks and pretty much make the banks go broke, which would then make the United States go broke. And this was due to companies having monopolies. Like, they would open a business and then they would partner their businesses with their other businesses, and then they would open banks for themselves, and then they would have the monopoly on the entire industry. So in 1890, the Sherman Antitrust Act was established, essentially saying you can't form trusts with intent to own a monopoly. pretty much outlawed all trusts. I mean, later it was amended and fixed and stuff like that, but that was it. But did that stop J.P. Morgan? Absolutely not. He continued his monopoly on the railroads, and he established a merging of Edison General Electric and Thomson Houston Company in 1892. And then in 1893, there was another bank panic. Go figure. So President Cleveland's like, oh no, J.P. Morgan, what do I do? And he's like, here's what you do. You sell shares of federal bonds. And that's how that started. And it worked. It stopped a complete and total economic collapse in 1893. And then in 1896, the Dow Jones Industrial Average was first calculated. And who do you think was on that Dow Jones Industrial Average? Of course, it was J.P. Morgan. And to this day, they still are. Ooh, I'm going to have to do more than one video on J.P. Morgan. Stay tuned. It's about to get spicy. So, we've gone through the 1800s, and now we are in the 1900s. In 1901, Theodore Roosevelt took office for the first time after the McKinley assassination. Nobody really knows about President McKinley. Did you know that 4 presidents were actually assassinated? It wasn't just the 2 that we hear about all the time. There were 4 of them. So you had President Garfield, and then you had President McKinley. Both of them were assassinated. So, but we're going to focus on McKinley. He was assassinated, right? And he was assassinated by Leon Kozlowski. Anyway, it's a really interesting story, so I definitely recommend you look into the McKinley assassination, because the way that this guy assassinated him was really low, like really low. Anyway, though, so he refused to apologize later on. They were like, are you going to apologize? What do you have to say for yourself? And he was like, no, this guy was the head of a corrupt government. So this guy actually lost his job in 1893. Didn't we just talk about 1893? What happened in 1893? Do your homework, take your notes. So President Theodore Roosevelt's deal was that what he wanted to do was completely stop all of these big birds in Wall Street from being big birds and just like taking over, you know. Meanwhile, in 1901, J.P. Morgan is doing great. He creates the first billion-dollar company in the United States. Anyway, so fast forward to 1906, and you've got this situation where you have, like I was talking about in the last video, you have this guy, these brothers, 3 brothers, and their last name was Hines. And they had a bank, and they had a trust, and they had a coal business, right? And they really wanted a monopoly against the 1890 Sherman Antitrust Act. So they tried to corner the market, the stock market. And we'll talk more about stock market later, I promise. But they wanted to corner it. So they did some really, like, questionable things, right? Anyway, it caused their company to go bankrupt, which caused their bank to go bankrupt, which caused people to panic and be like, if this bank is going bankrupt, then all the banks must be going bankrupt. So you've got President Theodore Roosevelt, who up until now has been opposing J.P. Morgan and his expenditure of all of his business ventures, being like, so hey, I know we've had some trouble, but like, can you like maybe... And J.P. Morgan was like, fine, but you've got to give me a monopoly. So J.P. Morgan manages to avert this crisis and make himself richer by buying the Tennessee Coal, Iron, and Railroad Company. I have more. I'm invested too, and I'm caffeinated, so this is going to be fun, because this is the part where it gets really interesting. This is crazy stuff, man. Okay, so 1901, J.P. Morgan funds the Panama Canal, and literally the whole Panama Canal. He just funds the whole thing, and President Roosevelt takes the credit for it still to this day. It's like under the Roosevelt jurisdiction, Panama Canal, it was J.P. Morgan. He did that. So that was just a fun fact. Anyway, moving on to the actual main course here. So J.P. Morgan, you know, continues to get richer and richer, and then he dies in 1913. And his company and all of his assets are then turned to his son. Fun fact, Federal Reserve notes were also created in 1913 as one of the two means of financing. Now, it wasn't until later, we'll talk about that they would be used as the only form of currency. Also in 1913, you had the Patterson Silk Strike. Basically, a bunch of people got really mad because they were being worked extra long hours for little pay, and it felt like they were in the middle of an economic recession, because they were, and basically they were just getting screwed, and they were like, we're not going to stand for this any longer, so they went on strike. So 2 prominent arrests, and 5 months later they lost. And this was going on everywhere all across the United States, right? So then you have in 1914 the Ludlow Massacre and the Colorado Coalfield War. The two are related. So 11 women and 1 child died whenever there was some kind of crazy miscommunication involving the Colorado National Guard and this group of people that were literally just coal miners. And John D. Rockefeller was accused of actually being the catalyst of this issue. More on Rockefeller to be discussed. So between 1914 and 1920, there was a series of bombings that was eventually leaked to this group called the Bresky Circle. And this all started happening right after the Ludlow Massacre. They bombed places like St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. They bombed Rockefeller's establishments. They did the Bronx County Courthouse, the American Woolen Company, and they also performed an explosion in 1920 on Wall Street. This was their biggest explosion, and it killed 38 people. And later, it was found that the target was most likely not Wall Street, New York Stock Exchange, but J.P. Morgan's bank. More about the Bresky Circle to come. This group of Italian guys got together, and they were led by Luigi Gallini. And by 1914, they had over 600 members that were just meeting in this little rundown place in Harlem City, and they started calling themselves the Bresky Circle. The reason they called themselves that was because of Gaetano Bresci. He killed King Umberto I of Italy after another massacre where people were really upset about the price of bread, so they just massacred a bunch of people. Dude was found guilty, but capital punishment was outlawed in Italy, so they didn't kill him. He was the first person in Italy to not be killed for assassinating someone. Anyway, though, he was mysteriously found dead in 1901. Some people think he hung himself. Some people think he was murdered. Anyway, though, these guys strongly opposed capitalism and its growing effects on the American economy. And they didn't like being paid just a little bit of money for a lot of work. And they didn't like being killed for being paid just a little bit of money for a lot of work and being mad about it. So why would they try to bomb St. Patrick's Cathedral? Maybe because it costed $160 million in today's money to build it. And that money was gotten from donors and tithers. So people's tithe money was literally going into this building. $160 million of it in an economic recession. Well, Mr. Rockefeller was actually a very rich person, and so was his entire family. Rockefeller actually owned a company called Standard Oil, which was eventually dissolved by Congress due to being a monopoly against the Sherman Antitrust Act. And it was broken down into several groups, including Exxon and Chevron. Ironically, because he was forced to dissolve his companies and sell them off into smaller bits, he became the country's first billionaire. Because it turns out his company as a whole was worth less money than all of the little companies that he sold combined. So because of the rising requests for oil, now coal is less needed. Enter the Colorado Coalfield War and the Ludlow Massacre. So after all of this went down, the Ludlow Massacre and all of this, a lot of miners were out of work in the coal fields. Enter the Rockefeller Foundation to save the day. They gave the government money to supply unemployment benefits for these unionized workers that were now out of a job conveniently. His children grew up to be prominent philanthropists, governors, and one of them was a vice president. That's all for today.